was really enthusiastic. Great job. Welcome back from spring break. This is super exciting for me because we're coming back and y'all are all refreshed and energized, and I know you're ready to go, right? That's why y'all have notes and paper that you got when you came in, because we're really going to dig in, and y'all are going to take notes, and y'all are going to learn, and it's going to be great. So I know we're coming back from spring break, and we haven't started school yet, but let's turn our minds back on. So we are jumping into a kind of a different book than what we might usually do up here in student ministry. We're jumping into the book of Hosea, and I think when Katie asked if anyone has read Hosea, no one raised their hands. And I kind of, in a way, expected that, because Hosea is an Old Testament book, and we don't always like to read the Old Testament. It can be kind of confusing and daunting, and there's a lot of weird names and kind of some crazy stories. Before I quit my job to go back to school, which I know that's always a great way to start, I was a Bible teacher, and I taught Old Testament. At the beginning of every class, I would ask my students about the Old Testament, what do they know? And students could rattle off stories, right? The Old Testament, we learned about David and Goliath and Adam and Eve and all these other stories, Noah and the Ark and Moses and all these things, but they couldn't really connect them. Right? So they kind of would lose track of the story, because the Bible is one book in a sense. And so they would know all these stories, but not how they all actually flowed together. And so as we start jumping into Hosea, we need to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page and kind of have an understanding of history, the history that's presented in the Old Testament, because Hosea does. Hosea is writing to a specific people at a specific time in a specific place, and they would kind of understand their collective history, right? So I could talk to you as Americans, and you know some American history, and we can kind of be on the same page. If I talk about George Washington, we're all kind of on the same page there. It's kind of like this. So Sarah watches Pretty Little Liars, right? Which is just a boo-boo show. It's just awful. And so clearly I don't watch it. Sorry to kind of put you on blast there, Sarah. But sometimes I'll come into the living room and she'll be watching. I'm kind of in and out, and I sit down and I kind of watch a portion of an episode with her. I can see what's happening, and I can kind of understand at some base level, what is going on. I can understand the words being said, but because I haven't followed from the beginning, I get kind of lost, right? I'm like, wasn't this guy dead? What's happening? This person was bad, now they're good, and I don't know. I just get completely lost, right? And so it just kind of goes to show the importance of following a story all the way through. And so in 26 minutes and 39 seconds, we're going to walk through the entire Old Testament. Ready? All right. This is why you have notes, so you can jot some down, because we are going to be going quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit on 5 major points. So these kind of 5 key themes that'll help us kind of keep track of where we are in the Old Testament. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning to start, because that makes sense, right? Anytime we start a story, we have to go to the beginning. So if we open up to Genesis 1:1, we see the first big theme, and it's creation. So Genesis 1:1 tells us that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the next 2 chapters are all about God creating this land, this earth that we see and experience. And it really, the way that it's worded, it seems like God kind of creates it for people, in a sense. We work on the earth because the earth was kind of designed that way. And the crown jewel of his creation is mankind. It's Adam, and then eventually his wife, Eve. And God places them in this garden, right? This beautiful, peaceful garden. And he places them in the garden to be, the term is image bearers, and not bearers. And that's kind of a weird term, but when we say image bearers, what we mean is someone who reflects something else. Kind of like an ambassador or a representative. So as an image bearer, man is supposed to represent God on the earth. And so God creates man and says, be fruitful and multiply. He's telling him, hey, keep creating, keep doing like what I'm doing. If you're a representative or an ambassador of someone, you're going to live by their rules, right? You can't just kind of choose to do whatever you want. The same was true for Adam and Eve. Unfortunately, the very third chapter of Genesis, everything goes wrong. And so this is our next big theme, the fall. So instead of these image bearers, these representatives of God on the earth, living the way that he defined for them, Adam and Eve decide to live life their own way. They choose to define good and evil for themselves, and they end up rebelling against God. And it's at this point where everything goes off the rails. Right? And so God addresses Adam and Eve and the one who tempted them. He's referred to as a serpent. It's Satan. And in this address, God tells Adam and Eve, there's consequences for this sin. Like, Adam, you're going to have to work hard now. Eve, childbirth is not going to be pleasant. And I'm sure if you ask any woman who's given birth, you're going to ask her mother, childbirth is not pleasant. And then he addresses the serpent. And to the serpent, God says something really interesting. He says to the serpent in Genesis 3:15, he says, I'm going to put enmity, which is a word for strife. There's going to be struggle between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. And he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Now, that's kind of a weird verse to look at. But what this verse is, it's called the proto-evangelion. So that's a nice Greek word for you to take home, proto-evangelion. And if you were to chop up that word, you would see proto and evangelion. Proto is first, and evangelion is gospel, or word for gospel or good news. And the reason why this is called the first gospel is because it's the first glimpse of good news, and it comes right after the first glimpse of really bad news, right? And so God tells Satan, he says, there's going to come a time where there's going to be a man who's born of a woman who's going to strike you down and destroy you, but not before you hurt him, right? It says he's going to strike his heel. And so this seed of a woman is going to be hurt, but ultimately he's going to destroy Satan, and along with Satan, sin, death, and evil. Right? And so you can see how this is kind of the first mention of the gospel. And it's incredible because God has created these worshipers and placed them in this beautiful garden, and they're supposed to spread worship of God everywhere. Instead, they define for themselves what they're going to worship. And God says, that's not going to be the case. I'm going to redeem this. I'm going to fix it. So God obviously has a plan in place, and he is going to use people, fallen people, to enact this plan. And this is kind of the rest of the Old Testament, how it works out. So Genesis 3 is kind of the prologue, and then we start to get into really the narrative. And so what we're going to see next, the next major theme, is that of covenant. And that's kind of a weird word, covenant. And what a covenant is, the simplest way that we can define covenant is as an agreement that establishes and defines a relationship. All right, so a covenant is a new type of relationship wherein two people agree to something. It's typically, I'm going to do this or be this, and you will do this or be this. All right, so 2 years ago, last Monday, I gave him the thumbs up. 2 years ago, last Monday, I had the best day of my life, right? My wedding day, wherein I got to marry Sarah. And part of our wedding was an exchange of vows. These vows are a covenant. This is the most common type of covenant that we see, and it's a powerful picture, right? Using marriage as a picture of a covenant. Me and Sarah went from being fiancés, or fiancés, it's different for girls. It's fiancé for guys and whatever. But we went from being fiancés, co-fiancés, to being a husband and wife. Right, and as we enter into this new relationship, that defines the relationship for us. God's going to work this way through a series of people in the Old Testament. And what he's doing is he's enacting his plan of redemption. He's saying, everything's gone wrong, but I'm going to make it right. He is using people to bring the seed of the woman, this Messiah, to crush the head of the serpent, like we saw in the proto-evangelion. The first person that we see specifically be establishing a covenant with God is Noah. Right? We don't often think about this, but after the flood, God establishes a new covenant with Noah. So the Genesis shows us early on the results of sin and how sin festers and grows. And by the time of Noah, everyone on the earth was corrupted and sinful and worshiping themselves and creation and not God and rebelling against them. And so God, in his just righteousness, says, I'm gonna wipe them off. But he saves one man and his family named Noah. And after the flood, God says, Noah, I'm never going to destroy the earth in a flood again. And the flood, this shows us something really important. And it's that sin, the fall, makes it clear that God is completely just in destroying that which is sinful. And so that would include us. But in the flood here, there's this turn from God saying, I'm not going to destroy, I'm going to redeem. And so right after we see Noah and the results of sin, we see a new man, and his name's Abram. Better, we know him as Abraham. Right? And God's going to establish a new covenant with Abraham, and this is truly incredible. God's covenant with Abraham is God making a series of promises to him. He says, Abraham, I'm going to give you a new land, and I'm going to give you an incredible amount of descendants, like a whole people, a whole nation is going to come from you. And through the land that I'm giving you, and through your people, I'm going to bless all nations. And so God's plan of redemption that he mentioned there at the very beginning of Genesis is being narrowed down into this one family, this one people, Abraham's people. And it's really incredible, God's covenant with Abraham, because it reads like a treaty, an ancient treaty. In ancient cultures, when you see a kingdom or a king come in and conquer a land, sometimes they would enter into a treaty where the king says, this is who I am. I'm the guy who conquered you, but I'm going to treat you well if you treat me well. If not, there's going to be consequences. But with Abraham, God takes on the consequences. He says, if I don't fulfill these promises to you, I will be the one who's destroyed. And that's not possible. That's not the case. That's not in God's nature. So God makes this incredible promise of land and people and a blessing to Abraham. The issue with Abraham is that he is very old. And old couples don't typically have children. And if you don't have the first child, you can't have a number of children, right? That's kind of how biology works. And so Abraham's like, I don't know, God. I'm kind of older. My wife, Sarah, is old, and so it's not likely that she's going to conceive. And so, Abraham's wife, Sarah, not my wife, Sarah. Sarah's young. That's weird anyway. And so Abraham says, I'm going to trust myself. I'm going to fulfill the promises of the covenant. And he goes off and does his own thing. And he does have a son. But God says, no, this is not the child of the promise that I told you. I got this. And years later, a son named Isaac is born to Abraham. And it's through Isaac that the covenant is going to be fulfilled more fully. Isaac has a son then named Jacob. And Jacob and his story, his sons, might be familiar to some of us. And Jacob's not a great guy. And this is one of the incredible things about the Bible is God uses, there's a phrase, God uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines, right? So God uses sinful, rebellious people, and it has to be this way because we're all sinful and rebellious. But Jacob is especially painted as not being great. Jacob, from the very beginning, is kind of like deceptive and sneaky, and the Bible doesn't paint a great picture of him. Yet it's through Jacob that God said the covenant is going to be passed along. These promises that God made to Abraham are going to be fulfilled even more fully. And God even changes Jacob's name to Israel, which is a much more familiar name to us than Jacob sometimes, because that's how the people of Abraham come to be known as Israel or Israelites. The book of Hosea is going to make this point that from the very beginning, the people of Israel are kind of sinful and rebellious and unfaithful to God, just as Jacob was. So Hosea is going to get to the point where he says, all of y'all are unfaithful, and it's not a surprise because Jacob was the same way. It's almost like something's just never changed in this family. We can't get this right. Yet, God's going to be incredibly faithful to Jacob and his people. It's Jacob who has 12 sons, and when you see that number 12, you might be thinking, oh, that kind of sounds familiar. It's because Israel is divided up into 12 tribes, or kind of smaller families, and they're named for Jacob's sons, right? That's an incredible kind of honor that Jacob is given. And probably Jacob's most famous son is named Joseph, and if we've heard the story of Joseph before, we know that he's taken off into Egypt. And Joseph is able to keep his family safe in Egypt. There comes a famine, and Joseph says, hey, come to Egypt, I'll take care of you. And so the Israelites find a home in Egypt for a short while. Unfortunately, that doesn't go too well for them. And that takes us to our next point, is Exodus. We'll come back to this covenant slide in a little bit. But the next major point that we see is the Exodus. The closing of the book of Genesis says that Israel is in Egypt, and then the book of Exodus opens, and it says that Joseph has passed on, and the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, didn't know him, and has actually enslaved his people, his family. And so for 400 years, the people of Israel, right, Abraham's family, is caught in this foreign land, and they're in captivity. They're enslaved. They're forced to do slave labor. And they begin to cry out. There's kind of this question, like, does God remember that he made a promise to us? He promised Abraham that we would have a land and people and stuff. And they begin to cry out. Well, God's going to call out of all these people who are caught in Egypt, he's going to call the most unlikely person to lead them out. And he's going to call a man named Moses. And Moses is spending some time in the wilderness, and he encounters this bush that is described as being on fire but not burning up. So that'd be kind of crazy to see. You're like, this bush is on fire, but it's still here. It's not being eaten up. What's up with that? And so Moses approaches it. And you might remember the scene if you've seen The Prince of Egypt, right? Yeah. So Moses approaches this bush, and it's really awkward in The Prince of Egypt because the guy doing the speaking parts, it's the same guy doing God and Moses. And he was also Batman, so it kind of sounds like it's Batman talking to himself. But anyway, in this conversation with God at the burning bush, God says to Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I didn't reveal myself to them as much as I'm going to you. In fact, I'm going to tell you my name, and my name is Yahweh. And I'm going to send you back to Egypt, and it's through you that I'm going to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. And we're going to have a new covenant, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. And that phrase, that simple sentence, that statement, is going to be very important. It's called the covenant formula. Right, so you're going to want to write this down. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Because once God says this to Israel, it becomes kind of one of the most important things they're ever going to hear. It's going to be especially important in the book of Hosea, as we'll see next week. So Moses is returned to Egypt, and through a series of plagues, God shows himself to be powerful over both Egypt and Israel, and he says, enough's enough, I'm going to bring my people out. Pharaoh keeps saying no, and so the worst plague yet comes, and it's the death of the firstborn of every Egyptian family. And God says, this is not going to happen to Israel, because Israel, what you're going to do is you're going to sacrifice a lamb. So there's going to be a debt paid already. There's already going to be a life laid down. And with that blood of the sacrificed lamb, you're going to cover your doorpost. And it's that same night that Pharaoh agrees to let Israel go. And that event, the Exodus, is going to be the central event of salvation for Israel. They're going to remember it forever. When they talk about God and who God is, they're going to say, God is the God who brought us out of Egypt. It's incredibly powerful. And in fact, this night, this meal that they took is going to be remembered as Passover. And Passover is still celebrated today. And it's during Passover when Jesus actually dies on the cross. And that's not by mistake. So God does deliver his people out of Egypt. And there's a reminder, God made a promise. He promised a land and he promised a number of descendants. So they come out of Egypt and, well, God seems to have fulfilled the promise of, Abraham having all these people. But what about the land? And so God gives the people a land, and this is our next big point. God establishes a kingdom. So if you jump 2 slides over, there you go. So God gave his people a land. If you read through the book of Joshua, you'll see all these battles that Israel won because God fought it for them. Yet the people are still faithless and sinful and continue to rebel against this God who's done incredible things for them. And if you read the book of Judges, you kind of see the cycle of how bad things will get at times. And it's at the end of the book of Judges that says there's no king in the land, so people kind of did whatever they wanted. And the people say, this isn't good. God gave us a king, blah, blah, blah. We really want a king. And God says, man, I'm your king, but I will put a king in place. And the king of Israel was different than any other king. The king of Israel was supposed to be someone who followed the law perfectly. See, when God brought Israel out of Egypt, he gave a set of instructions to Moses that said, for my people Israel, here's how you live in relationship with me. Because God desired to live with his people, so he said, here's how you do that. Because God can't live where there's sin. God told his people, here's how to live without sin, and they couldn't really follow it. The point of the king of Israel was to be one who followed the law perfectly. Unfortunately, we know that this isn't the case. No king follows the law perfectly. The most important king from this time is a man named David, and David kind of seems familiar to us, right? We've heard of David and Goliath before, possibly. David also shows himself to be sinful and rebellious at times and unfaithful. But God approaches him and he says, David, I'm going to make another covenant with you. And it's going to be through you, David, that this Messiah comes, the seed of the woman that was promised all the way back in Genesis. And so God's plan of redemption has focused down on a family and a nation and now a specific line that this Messiah is going to come from. And David doesn't just become important, but his city, Jerusalem, becomes really important. Jerusalem was incredibly important to the people of Israel. It's kind of like the Vatican and Washington, D.C. rolled into one. If we were Catholic Americans, that's how important it would be. Because Jerusalem was where political and religious events occurred. Because of the faithlessness of kings, there comes a time where the people of Israel split. Right? Sinful rebellion leads to a split in the kingdom, and 10 of the tribes, right, remember there's 12 tribes, 10 of the tribes of Israel go north, and they break away, and they're called Israel now. The 2 tribes on the southern end stay faithful to Yahweh, to God, and they're called Judah. In the south of Judah, that's where Jerusalem is, that's where Jesus is born. But the northern kingdom of Israel is immediately idolatrous. Right? They show their unfaithfulness to God by worshiping other gods. And it's during this time that we see a new group of people pop up, and they're called prophets. And prophets are kind of weird guys. When we see prophets, people don't tend to like them in the Old Testament because they kind of have bad messages, right? They always point out sin. They say, you're sinful here in this area. You're not being faithful to God's covenant here. We need to repent. We need to turn back. We need to turn from our sin and turn back to worshiping God. And that brings us to Hosea. Hosea is one of these prophets. And Hosea speaks to these 10 northern tribes of Israel. And he says, you've broken the covenant. You've turned away from God, and you're being incredibly unfaithful to the instructions and to the God who's brought you out of Egypt. And he says there's going to be trouble because of that. And Hosea tells them that there's going to be destruction in Israel. They're going to be taken away from their land. And something that the people in Hosea's time might have understood that we don't, that's kind of like a picture of Eden. Right? Sin drove people out of Eden away from God. Sin is going to drive Israel and later Judah out of their land and away from God. And Hosea is going to make his point very interestingly. He's going to show how God really feels about this unfaithfulness. He's going to compare God to a faithful husband married to a faithless wife. And sometimes we kind of don't understand what God might be thinking or feeling in a situation, but Hosea is going to help us understand, and that's what we're going to be getting into next week. And it's going to be incredibly powerful. The key theme, the key verse that we're going to be focusing on in Hosea is Hosea 6:6, and it'd be great and incredible for all of us to memorize this. It says, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." See, at times in Israel's history, they did some of the right things, but they did it out of a place of idolatry. Right? They thought, like, we'll appease God. God likes us. Clearly, he's not like completely abandoned us yet. Out of all the dumb things we've done, and he's given us this land, so we're good. If we just kind of appease God by doing things, things will continue to go well for us. And God says, no, that was never the point. The point was that you're going to be my people, and you would know me, and you would worship me, and it would be through you, like I told Abraham, all nations are going to be blessed. Because it's through you that this Messiah that I talked about all the way back in Genesis 3:15 is going to come. But you turn against that, and you start doing other things. Hosea won't leave the people of Israel without hope. He will say there will be a time of restoration. And sometimes when we look at the Old Testament, we kind of wonder, so what? How does this connect to the New Testament? I like to spend time in the New Testament and see what Jesus has done for me, and how, because I believe in Jesus, it says that I'll live with him in heaven one day. And there's one more covenant that's mentioned in the Old Testament. It's in Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah is a prophet very similar to Hosea. Jeremiah, while Hosea is in the northern kingdom, Jeremiah is in the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem is. And it's in Jerusalem that Jeremiah says destruction is coming for Judah because of their faithlessness as well. But he makes this incredible promise. We get to Jeremiah 31. This is the last slide, by the way, the New Covenant slide. We get to Jeremiah 31. And Jeremiah 31 makes this incredible promise. It's a brand new covenant. And God says, there's going to come a day where there's going to be a new covenant. And he goes on to describe this new covenant. And he says, this new covenant is not going to be one that's written on tablets that people see. It's going to be something that's written on their heart. So there's going to be this inward change. And he goes on further to say, the people who take part in this new covenant are also not going to have to remind each other to love God, because they're going to. If someone is loving God, you don't have to say, hey, love God, This is why when we get to the New Testament, and we see Jesus at his last meal on earth before he dies, he takes bread and he takes wine with his disciples as they're celebrating Passover. Right? The meal that commemorated the Exodus, when the people put the blood of the lamb on their doorpost. The meal that they took to celebrate and remember that, how God brought them out of Egypt. Jesus takes that bread and the wine, he breaks the bread and he says, this is my body broken for you. Then he takes that cup of wine and he says, this is my blood that's spilled for you in the new covenant. Through his sacrifice, through Jesus' sacrifice, like the Passover lamb that was sacrificed all the way back in Egypt, Jesus is enacting this new covenant that we read about in Jeremiah 31. And that's the covenant that when we realize our sin, that we are not worshiping God like we were created to, that we are sinful and we're rebellious and we're unfaithful to God, and we repent of that, so we turn away and we ask for forgiveness of our sins, that's the covenant that we enter into. So when Jeremiah describes in Jeremiah 31 this new covenant that's written on hearts, that's the covenant that we take part in. That's the inward change that we experience. And so we see this whole plan of redemption. That's what the Bible is. The Bible is God's plan of redemption for a people. And so we read the Old Testament and we see how God worked through Israel as his people. We get to the New Testament, and guess what? We're now part of that same people. We can go on even further, because the Bible doesn't end at Hosea, nor does it end at the Gospels. In fact, we get one more book. And in Jeremiah, not only does Jeremiah promise that part of this new covenant is that there'll be this new group of believers, but Jeremiah also promises that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And at first glance, that's kind of weird to us. Why does Jeremiah promise that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed? Well, the thing is, Jerusalem is destroyed, and it's restored. And the picture of the restoration of Jerusalem is the recreation of all things, of God completely making all things right. And we get to Revelation 21. That's the second to last chapter in the Bible. And John says this. He says, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea." And he says, "I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God.'" Notice that covenant language again that's used. "And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne," it's talking about God, says, "I'm making everything new." So here's the point. We get to see the end of the story. Like just as we saw the beginning and the effect that sin caused, we get to see the end goal. We get to see that final redemption. It's God making all things new and putting worshipers back in a new heavens and new earth, a new garden where people will know God and worship him like we were originally meant to. And it's all because of what God has done. So next week we're going to be looking specifically into the book of Hosea, and we're going to see the story of Hosea and his family and how it shows a very real, very tangible picture of God's faithful love to those who are unfaithful. And it's going to be incredibly, I think, challenging to us, but also encouraging. So let me pray for us. Father, we thank you that you show us faith when we are unfaithful. You show us love when we're unloving, and you make all things new and right. And you've given us such an incredible picture of your love for us in the book of Hosea, and that, Lord, you're good and we're not. And Lord, we thank you that we can look and read this story of how we turned away from you, but you never turn away from us. And we love you. Shall I pray? Amen.